Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the visiting fellows and the staff of JWJI, I'd like to welcome you to today's Race and Difference colloquium session. Today, we are very excited to be kicking off a week of discussions of diversity and college admissions with a wonderful talk by Professor W. Carson Byrd. Dr. Byrd is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Louisville and on loan to the University of Michigan at the same time. He was previously the Research Associate in the Center for Race and Social Policy Research at Virginia Tech, where he completed his PhD in sociology. He got his bachelor's degree from Mars Hill College. His research examines race and educational inequality, inter and intraracial interactions, and their influence on identities and ideologies, and the connections among race, science, and knowledge production. These three areas intertwine under a broader research umbrella examining how educational institutions, particularly colleges and universities, can simultaneously operate as centers for social mobility and engines of inequality. So today he's going to be talking about his upcoming book. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. W. Carson Byrd.
Thank you, Dr. Gillespie, for the wonderful welcome. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be part of the Johnson Institute's colloquium speaker series. As I was mentioning a little bit before we all went live, getting an invitation to be part of such a prestigious university's colloquium series focused on racial uplift and racial equality is something that was a highlight of a very, very rough year, I think we would all say, to say the least. So it was, again, just a wonderful honor to be here with all of you today. And so, as Dr. Gillespie was mentioning, this is based off of my forthcoming book, Behind the Diversity Numbers, Achieving Racial Equity on Campus, that's going to be published by Harvard Education Press. And one of the things I've always been interested in is how we understand the world, which is one reason why I got into sociology, but also what are the information we use to understand the world, and you know, increasingly numbers are it. So today we're going to kind of focus on what is it about numbers that can tell us about how race is important to not only society, but to the institutions that we're at. So there's this case. Some of y'all have heard about it. It's an affirmative action case called Student for Fair Admissions v. Harvard. And what Student for Fair Admissions has charged Harvard with is discriminating against Asian and white applicants, and saying that there's quotas on Asian and white applicants to promote diversity. And you know, there's a lot of discussions about how do you know, and they were using economists and the statistical measures to really get at these things. But this one headline that's on the screen right now, you know, it really caught my attention. It says at the Harvard trial, statistics give way to personal stories about diversity. And the thing that really stands out about this is if we're talking about why race matters, why diversity and equity matters for our experiences, for our lives, why is it so troubling, so odd that we would actually talk to people about their lives? Why are we hiding behind numbers? And so this kind of put me into a position where I went down a rabbit hole and started thinking about how quantitative work is given high level legitimacy, how we always defer to numbers in many instances for summarizing human experiences, and trying to think about what are the latent consequences of these things for how we might understand racial inequality, and also what we should be doing about it. And so higher education uses quantitative metrics all the time. And I promise you, I'm not going to get into formulas or statistics beyond a little bit. But a lot of this is just trying to get at, well, how can we, if we use these numbers, how could we do it better? But also, when do we need to stop using numbers? And remember that we're talking about people, and we should talk with and work with the communities on and around our campuses. So for today's talk, we're going to first dive into rethinking what we understand normal colleges to be. right? When you say you're going to college, they're like, oh, okay, cool, what college? And there's a lot of differences among the colleges and how people understand what those differences mean. And then we're going to kind of dive into what does quantifying diversity mean for our college campuses and how we understand the inequalities that are around us. And then start getting behind them, if you will. And then next, we're going to dive into this thing called campus climate. It's like we've talked about these things a lot, but what does the research say? How does it say it? And what are the things that it's pointing us to change? And why could that maybe be a detriment to trying to create more equitable and inclusive campuses? And then finally, what are some initial steps, right? Like sometimes we like to poke at all these different issues and talk about different disparities instead of being gap gazing and talking about where things need to change. Let's start talking about how we should change. Okay, so I'm going to pepper that in a little bit more throughout the talk today, but towards the end, we're going to have some main takeaways for campuses. Emory, University of Michigan and Louisville, anywhere and everywhere is really what hopefully we'll have today from this conversation. So this is a very, very short history of race in American higher education. Way too short, really, but I don't want to bore you with all the details, but they are important. So since the founding of American higher education, race and racism has been at the foundation for how institutions function, who's on campus and how. So anytime we think about the conversation of affirmative action in college admissions or racial equity on campus, these things did not just come up in the last few years or the last few decades. They've been here since the very beginning. And so during the colonial and antebellum eras of higher education, these institutions were promoted for assimilation of immigrants, but also for enslavement of African Americans and African slaves, but also the genocide of indigenous communities, and supported this emerging college curriculum and educational sector. So early on, colleges and universities were not for everybody. And we can kind of discuss later on in the Q&A if they're still for everybody as we purport, or if we still have a long way to go. And the answer is yes, we still have a long way to go. So at the early part of this was mainly for white planters in the South, for example, and the elite in the Northeast, and their families, mainly men. Women were often not allowed to go to college until later on in the 1800s. But even then, that was kind of shortened in terms of what kinds of experiences were allowed. And so post-Reconstruction, new forms of colleges started to develop. Matter of fact, that's one of the fastest growing eras of higher education was after Reconstruction. But this is also when we start seeing an explicit segregated system of institutions. So many people know about land-grant colleges that developed with the Morrill Act, but there were two Morrill Acts. The first were for white institutions. The second were for what we now identify as historically Black colleges and universities. So they even made sure that when institutions were founded, that there were explicit ways that they were different, even within the same state, and limited social mobility opportunities for different families. Also, just to kind of note with the land-grant colleges, the reason why they're called land grants was because of the stolen land from Native American communities were given to states and to these founding institutions to gain wealth and to gain prestige, right? So again, there's a very deep connection between race and racism that are at the core of our institutions and why they even exist today that we need to keep in mind. So after World War II, this was another really big era of expansion in the US higher education system. But this is also when we start seeing the downfall of eugenics following Nazi Germany's prominence, but how these things influence what we use today, like the standardized test, right? So the standardized test, the college admissions test, were partially influenced by the IQ tests that were used in France, but then were transformed to segregate and to propagate public policies of eugenics. And so these things have not gone away. Obviously, we are test optional in many cases, but what these tests actually say or don't say is really important for us to keep in mind. We'll kind of dive into that a little bit later. But also in the post-World War II era, we see a solidification of segregated higher education opportunities, but also a rise of people fighting against that, right? The long civil rights movement, for example, is one of those fights against the segregated higher education opportunities. And so again, into the 1970s with the mass expansion that was going on, you saw a fight for equitable opportunities, not just from the civil rights movement, but from Black Power movement, from Native American communities, from Chicano and Latinx communities in the Southwest and the Far West, for example. So there was this attempt to make our institutions live up to their ideals of being open and public, right? But also making sure that representation wasn't just about who was on campus, but what they're learning. And so we've seen these continued battles from the 1970s, which were mostly student-led, and I want to put that out there, that students were at the heart of this, right? This wasn't something that many institutions were just so willingly to do in terms of desegregate and to open up the curriculum to talk more about the world and who's in it. Affirmative action policies for admissions were developed in the 60s and 70s, and they were then, implemented, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, weakened. So what we think of as affirmative action today is nowhere close to what it was envisioned, nor how it was enacted in earlier parts of US history. The development of different units for student and faculty support, the foundation of Black studies, ethnic studies, women's studies, all of these things were a part of opening up the campus not for representation again, but for conversation, right? For expanding our learning. And so this was, again, creating these disciplines and courses that weren't there before or were not seen as needed. And so as higher ed continues to grow and diversify in many respects, there's still opportunities and experiences that were never fully desegregated nor created equitably, right? So we can still see this in terms of different disparities in who's more likely to go to college and what colleges, who's more likely to graduate, who's getting support, who's more likely to be a scientist. All these different things, right, are ways we can start examining how inequality is around us every day on our campuses. We also see some interesting things with funding. Funding is not equitable. We talk about this with the K through 12 system oftentimes, but we don't look at how, say, public higher education is inequitable, right? And so Maryland has a longstanding case about program duplication where a predominantly white college was able to have different programs and effectively siphon off students and funding away from the same program at a historically Black college in the state. And so there's been this back and forth legal battle about the money, the compensation for this, the support, right, that's not going away. So these things aren't just, emblematic of our past, but they're right now in our present and will be in our future if we're still trying to commit to creating more equitable situations on our campuses and in our communities. And so when we think about these things, people generally support diversity and inclusion, both in society and higher education in many ways, but we still need to critically examine, what do we know about diversity and inclusion? How do we identify these things in higher education? And we need to start thinking about, well, if we see all these inequities on our campuses, what does that mean about how embedded race and racism is to our institutions? So this gets us to thinking about our colleges as what colleague and sociologist Victor Ray labels racialized organizations. And so what's key about this is understanding that race isn't entering a college through bodies or courses or policies, but as the short little history we just talked about highlights, it's been there at the very beginning, right? History shows how racial stratification and inequality have not just been historical relics, but are everyday realities for people. And this echoes what's known as racial formation theory, that over time, how we think about stratification and inequality in society builds on the development of racial categories, the meanings people give to it and society gives to it, the stratification of resources and opportunities, and the shaping of inequality overall, right? These patterns that we see in everyday life. And so a lot of policies and processes on our colleges could be considered forms of racialization or creating meaningful differences for people's opportunities and life chances. So when we just kind of scratch the surface, we notice that some institutions are labeled historically white colleges or Hispanic serving institutions, minority serving institutions. But what about the other colleges? What about Michigan, Louisville, UVA, Emory, Duke, North Carolina? What are those? Well, oftentimes we call them just colleges, right? They're just a normal college. But really what these designators are showing is where we're making explicit racial differences, right? And even if you talk to people who work in different types of institutions that might be labeled Hispanic serving institution, for example, they don't necessarily agree on what this means, not just for the institution's priorities and who's represented, but how to go about living up to what an HSI is supposed to be, right? So there's meanings to these designators that we give, but it also shows how stratification and inequality and difference is a part of everyday life through our colleges and universities. And so similar to the way people use labels and designators to matter about colleges, that also means that we talk about racial inequality a certain way, right? You can see this in how people might dissuade somebody from attending a historically white college instead of a predominantly white one, right? That somebody sees the quality of education at one as better than the other because of the racial designator. And that has nothing to do with whether somebody's going to enjoy college, whether they're going to get a great education, anything like that. It's just the presumption that by having a label, there's a meaningful difference there, right? It's what a racial organization looks like on the surface. So these labels can signal where people and organizations fit within the opportunity structure of racialized society. And it's not that they're disconnected, it's relational, right? That you don't have a difference in meaning unless you create a relationship between two kinds of organizations in this case, for example. So how do they work? Well, organizations are kind of like meso-level structures. So when you think about micro, we're going to get sociology, social psych here for a little bit. When you think about this, micro level is like our individual everyday lives and how we connect to small groups, whereas the meso level is moving us up to organizations and how we work within, say, a college. The macro level is more like the system, right? The society. And so a racialized organization is a vehicle for racializing people, places, spaces, knowledge, and connecting these things to opportunities and resources. And so beneath these things are what are known as schemas, or they're like the unwritten rules and logics of how we think about things, right? Like the common sense, like why would you not do something? Well, you just don't do it. We might not say it explicitly, right? But really the unwritten rule book for explaining how to write the rules in terms of where do we see opportunities and resources and how should they be allocated, right? And so these rules are attached to resource distribution. And then we start going through the organizational topography, if you will. How do we navigate inequalities, right? So the easiest way to kind of think about this is the presumption that in the US, everybody has equal opportunity for K through 12 education, and everybody should be doing a great job with whatever K through 12 schools they have. The assumption is that all K through 12 schools are equal, but it takes literally 1 minute to ask somebody a question about, do you think everybody should be able to do well at their K through 12 schools? They'll say yes, and you say, well, are all these schools equal? And they'll say no. Right. So this very thin veil of equality gives way to showing how schools and colleges, for example, are connected to inequalities that we must navigate in everyday life. For a simple example about what happens at colleges for how this works, faculty are evaluated about teaching, research, and service, right? Those are the three pillars of our work. And so service is often given the least weight, it's the least compensated, but faculty of color, particularly women faculty of color, are engaged in these service activities more through mentoring, serving on diversity committees, serving on any student organization as sponsors, doing this work more than their white colleagues. And so because it's not weighed as much when it comes to tenure and promotion review, people are said, well, you should just, see that there are clear guidelines, that service isn't where you should be spending your time. You should think about doing better in the classroom and writing more grants and publishing more articles, all those things. So just say no. But what that does is reinforce the campus inequalities. The policies do not address the inequalities. This work is needed, right? The service work is absolutely pertinent to supporting students, to supporting colleagues through difficult times, different kinds of situations they might be going through. It's part of what we should be doing. So instead of saying you should just say no, perhaps we should actually change the policies to recognize where the inequalities exist and who's doing more of the work, instead of just giving back to this kind of unwritten set of rules of, well, this is how we do things here, so maybe you should adjust. Perhaps it should be the organization that adjusts, not the person. When we think about these different inequalities in colleges, we have to make sense of them. And so Eduardo Benilla Silva created this racial ideology as a framework, right? Or this concept for the frameworks to explain how racial inequality works in the world and justify, rationalize, and even challenge it if you disagree with it, right? And so what this does is allow us to figure out, well, when is something considered unequal? Is that immoral? Is that unjust? Right? What does that mean? Right? And what happens in the US in particular is we're a very individualistic society. So anytime we think that somebody is successful or fails, it's really because they did something, not that the opportunity structure around them allowed them to do something perhaps more than somebody else, right? So the whole conversation is about people, maybe small groups or communities, never on the structural inequality around people that they have to navigate, right? We always go back to, you should just work harder, you should study more, maybe you should take up a second job, right? Not that your first job doesn't pay you, right? All of these things are always focused on the individual, never about the broader structure around people. And so this reinforces the organizational schemas for how they work, how they function, and how they align inequality with the goals, right? So if we think about, say, getting a grade in a class, somebody could work really hard and reach out and do all the things that they're supposed to in a class, but not get a good grade. Does that mean that they're not capable, that they don't deserve an A, or that they didn't exhibit A work? No. But we still kind of construct that as anything that you do is based on yourself, not that maybe the teaching assistant never actually returned your emails, or maybe the topic you chose was not understood by the professor in the class as well as maybe it should have been, right? There's a lot of different things that come into play that doesn't necessarily mean that you did something, but perhaps everything around you reshaped what you did to have a different meaning than what it could, right? And so this voids the intentions of racial inequality, right? So not one individual action is why we have racial inequality. And you don't need to have good intentions for this, right? A lot of stuff can happen with some good intentions, and most of that is not good outcomes. And so a lot of this is quite, leads to, if we see inequality, then maybe we should make a change. But the problem is, if it's not written into how our organizations function, how we understand them to work, then these are considered illegitimate intrusions into the normal meritocratic, neutral function of organizations, right? That organizations are not racialized, they function meritocratically. You get what you get because you put in whatever you put in, right? And that, again, that doesn't give you the full picture. And so during different organizational routines or the processes that happen in everyday life in our colleges, for example, and admissions processes, which we'll get into. These racial schemas connect to resources and bureaucracies, right? So a resource in a college admissions situation would be getting a letter in the mail saying you were accepted. The bureaucracy behind the scenes is how did they arrive at that decision, right? So this can solidify a lot of different status inequalities. If we see that patterns are occurring in terms of who's more likely to get in or not. And these schemas kind of reinforce these everyday processes of, well, we followed the process, we made sure it was as equitable as it could have been. So obviously this was an impartial judgment, even though that's not necessarily the case, right? So I told you we're going to talk a little bit about numbers and why they matter. And so quantification is what the process is, making meaning out of numbers, right? How numbers become representative of people and experiences and social phenomena, right? Rates of graduation, chances of winning the lottery. These are all numbers, right? They all have meanings, they all have formulas. But again, there's a lot more behind the scenes. And so with quantification, what ends up happening is we truncate complex social phenomena to manageable, observable units. Think about college rankings, right? I don't like them. Most people don't, but people like to use them. And they think that they are objective measures. They think that if we just focus on these one group of numbers, we can figure out what are the best colleges. Even though there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, that might not mean that what you're getting is the truth about how good an institution is at, say, providing social mobility opportunities for students and for which students, right? And so quantification is that production of the numbers and their communication. And so a lot of people are behind the scenes. It's not just one person pulling levers, right? There's a lot of different people that are involved in creating the numbers and how we use them. And so just briefly, you go through a process of categorization of information into bins, right? And then you classify them and relate them. Then you count them, that's enumeration. And then you give it a value by communicating, say college ranking. It has a value because it's supposed to show you what are the best or worst colleges on, certain kinds of measures, right? But also dequantification can happen where you take something that's really quantified and then you just remove it and you use more subjective qualitative measures, right? But again, quantitative information isn't wholly objective either, and we have to kind of keep that in mind. So when we're talking about diversity and inclusion in higher education and how it's quantified to inform decisions, there's a lot of pitfalls that happen because we start aiming at the numbers. As Wendy Espel and Michael Sauter have written, as a new idea or technology becomes available and new groups begin to use it, the meaning of the innovation changes, including the nature of the problems it is designed to solve. So instead of truncating information down so people can figure out, what could be a good institution to attend, what ends up happening is that institutions start aiming for better numbers and figuring out how do you game the system to get better numbers, right? How do I make myself look good from the formulas that create, say, the US News and World Report rankings? And so quantification can be considered a form of racialization, a process of creating meaning and applying it to different spaces, places, and people, right? And so you create and use diversity numbers, and these things rely on categorization and classification and assignment of racialized meanings to people, to cultural objects, to material resources and opportunities, right? So this is where numbers start mattering for how we understand racial inequality, right? And so this categorization and classification reflect ongoing racial projects of different organizations. How we understand what campus representation for different students looks like at Emory or at the University of Michigan or Louisville or anywhere else for that matter is because we have other kinds of categories and processes from other organizations like the US Census that inform how we try to figure out who's on campus, right? And so the everyday use of race and racial categories give this a sense of legitimacy and objectivity, right? That because we use them, they must be good. And in many cases, they're not, but we don't step back and think about, well, why is that, right? And so through this kind of rearticulation of diversity through measurement, analysis, and policy, higher ed showcases how universities perpetuate and shift the racialization of people and their experiences, and then talk about what resources and opportunities should or shouldn't apply for their organization's purposes in relation to this numbers, right? So again, this is where the rubber hits the road, if you will. Through these kinds of metrics, through these analyses, we start giving meaning to why we make the decisions that we do. Why does a certain student organization get more money than another? What about staffing? What about support? What about trying to invest in mentoring programs? All these different things matter, but oftentimes it becomes a number-driven component to that decision, right? So we were talking about this a little bit earlier, that oftentimes a great example of where diversity and quantification really hits the ground running is in college admissions. And we got to talk about Lori Loughlin, sorry. Everybody knows her from her roles as an actress. But a lot of people also noticed that she was part of the Varsity Blues admission scandal of paying or bribing through quote unquote side doors to get their children into prestigious institutions. And one of the reasons why people were wondering, why would somebody that has millions of dollars, that's a celebrity, why would they do this? Well, part of it is image management. If their child doesn't go to the quote unquote right schools, they're not seen as a good parent. So part of this was their convoluted mental gymnastics kind of way of saying, well, if I'm a good parent, I need to make sure I do everything I can to get my child into, in this case, the University of Southern California, right? But at the same time that this was going on, the SFFA case against Harvard and other race-conscious admissions cases against North Carolina, Princeton, and Yale were starting to come to the surface, right? And so what they were really talking about was the way that we do college admissions isn't right. But a lot of people don't understand, what does college admissions do anyway? And so to understand that, we kind of need to understand holistic admissions. So holistic admissions review is the approach that people take to getting all this information, the grades that you submit, coursework, the test scores, the essays, the letters of reference when considered, all into a packet to start figuring out, would you be a good fit for Emory University, for example? And so staff either use a whole file approach, or a whole person, or a whole context. And so these are overlapping. And so a whole file approach means that staff would read an applicant's entire file and not weigh one attribute more than another when rendering a decision. Now, when it comes to the whole person approach, they would want to get to know them as a person, so to speak, and not relegate who they are to just certain features, right? And the whole context is putting all this within the community and the schools that, that applicants were a part of. And what happens is, unlike the popular view that something is a determining factor, no one thing is a determining factor. As many college admission staff will tell you, it's more of an art than a science to create a class, as sociologist Mitchell Seaven wrote in his book. So again, a lot of the affirmative action cases that we hear about, they keep saying that race is a determining factor, that it hinged on whether somebody was of a certain race or ethnicity or not for whether they got in. The fact of the matter is, it can't happen that way. And it hasn't been able to happen that way for decades now, starting with Alan Bakke v. University of California Regents case, which got rid of quotas. So anytime somebody says, what do you think of affirmative action? They say, well, I'm against quotas. Supreme Court says so too, since 1978, right? So let's move past that. Let's talk a little bit more about what these things are, right? Let's not use tropes. Let's talk about reality, okay? So people still want to talk about, well, how much does race really matter for where people go to college, or at least their acceptance rates and all these things, and how many colleges even consider race, right? So let's get to some of these numbers. So when we look at it, since 1972, the odds that a Black or Latinx applicant gains admission to a highly selective school has declined, not increased, since the peak of the civil rights and Black Power movements. So let me repeat that. It's gone down, right? Not gone up. When you consider race in admissions as like that usage of race as one of the many factors in holistic admissions review, it's actually declined since the 1990s, particularly for public and less selective colleges. So again, race isn't as much of a factor over time. It's actually lessened, right? So only 15.1% of all four-year colleges, not-for-profit colleges, consider race during admissions. That's just 352 institutions out of over 2,300, right? And if we think about the highly selective ones, the ones that we always talk about, Harvard and Princeton and Yale and Stanford and all of them, right? The ones that are the focus for most of the affirmative action cases in the US, it's only 5.3%. That's it. 124 colleges are who we always focus on. Not the rest of the 2,300, but just 124. And when we think about where most people go to college, they attend school around where they grew up. Most people attend college within 50 miles of where they grew up. And if you attend a public institution, you attend school within 20 miles of your home. And most colleges accept a majority of their applications every year. So the chance of encountering race-conscious admissions are not only minuscule, but to have it actually factor in selective admissions is even less, right? So this decrease in considering how race and racism can influence a person's life in college admissions highlights how processes of quantification are part of the everyday life of colleges, right? That we're seeing a decrease in the consideration of racial inequality that might influence somebody's life. And instead, we have these tropes about who's more likely to go where, right? So when we think about holistic admissions, grades and test scores are more rigid, right? They're more quantified. An A is a 4.0, a test score is a test score, but race is dequantified. Anytime that we see race used in college admissions, it's mostly discussed through essays, like how they encountered, a student encountered an experience of racial discrimination, for example, right? But this also makes quantifying merit seem more objective, right? But we know that what classes you get into in high school, whether you get sent to the principal's office, whether you can even walk freely down a hallway in a high school, is not just an objective thing, right? It's very racialized. So again, how we view these things are really important. And so over the last 40 years, race has since morphed into this very amorphous cultural attribute of diversity, right? So this isn't what was originally described as diversity. It was very explicit about race and ethnicity. Now it's removed itself from the taboo of race, that talking about diversity is talking about all the cultural attributes that people can bring to an organization, for example, right? But it also whitens what diversity is, right? That anybody can be diverse. You just have to show how, right? That's how this is kind of transformed. And in any time that we talk about diversity in college admissions, oftentimes it's not just race and ethnicity, if at all. It includes socioeconomic status, whether you're the first in your family to go to college, athletics and other characteristics, whether you're really good at the cello, right? That can play into whether you can contribute to the diversity of a college. But this has been because of a rollback with considering race-conscious policies in society. So the College Board tried to quantify adversity to try to make it easier for college admissions offices to consider other information. But what happens is they try to quantify everything but the racial inequality around students. And what that does is it removes a factor in everybody's lives. It's just, how does it matter, right? So this information can be helpful, but not as helpful as perhaps one would hope. So when we go back and talk about how colleges operate as racialized organizations through the college admissions practices, policy changes can mean associated shifts in access, right? And so this explains, how these institutions, how these admissions offices can act as gatekeepers to resources and interests. And people understand this, right? So Frank Sampson did a really ingenious study where he asked respondents to rate how important merit is in admissions between two fictitious applicants. And what he found was people would rate merit as more important when considering an African American applicant, but less important for Asian American applicants, right? So now we get to see how merit is racialized and how it's thought of as part of colleges as a racialized organization that gives resources and interest to people, right? Acts as a gatekeeper. So couldn't we just do something that doesn't include race? Like, this is a very common point, and I'll just be really brief. The answer is no, because socioeconomic disparities are not the same thing as racial disparities. They're interconnected, right? Not everybody who is white is rich, and not everybody who is black is poor, right? And so we have to keep these things in mind. Matter of fact, when we look at race neutral kind of approaches to admissions, it doesn't really live up to the same amount of diversity that you get when you consider race conscious policies, because you're thinking and considering how racial inequality matters, right? In fact, it actually lowers the socioeconomic diversity on college campuses. So again, you need both, and you don't need either or. And so affirmative action bans are also linked to the political context of states, right? And so what's been found is when the diversity of a campus increases in terms of fewer white students on campus, that enacts a political reaction by constituents, and they'll vote to try to put an affirmative action ban in to not consider race, right? But obviously these things matter. Race matters, right? We've had these conversations for a while, but I think it needs to be said again, race matters. And so when we rethink college admissions, I'll just kind of go through these a little quickly. Not utilizing race conscious admissions policies doesn't mean that race doesn't matter. It does. But we also have to realize that merit is racialized, right? Who is able to get into the AP and honors courses matters. And it's not just about how good somebody is at math, right? When we think about admissions tests, they don't really predict how well you're going to do in college. They really don't predict beyond maybe the second semester for most people. But if we decide to drop admissions tests like a lot of people are doing right now, we also have to do that for institutional financial aid, which is a barrier for people to attend college. So if we're saying we're not going to consider your test scores for admissions, we also need to say that we're going to be knee blind and we're not going to consider your test scores for financial aid as well, right? And so all this turns to critical mass. And people have talked about this for a while, but critical mass is at the center of a discussion known as the educational benefits of diversity. So how does an increased diversity of students on campus from different backgrounds, how does that change what you learn and what you experience on college? And so a lot of people use the numbers, right, to say critical mass is a very specific number, but it's not. It's more dynamic than that. And it's not just about representation. Although representation matters, and it really does, it's not just about making sure you have a certain number of Black or Latinx students on campus. It's never been about that. It's been a lot more about the learning environment. So when we think about this, critical mass, again, is beyond campus representation, but we have to think about how diversity could also hide segregation, right? Diverse campuses can be segregated. Just like racialized tracking can lead to different classrooms in the K through 12 school, we can have racialized and racially segregated measures on our courses. But to think about this, we have to go back to Du Bois, right? And his studies in the Philadelphia Negro in 1899, and a lot of his Atlanta studies that poked holes at how we use quantitative metrics to expand our knowledge of inequality. And to do this, we have to make sure we don't fall prey to what's known as deficit logics, or blaming people for their circumstances that they themselves did not create, that they just found themselves into, right? And so quantitative approaches shed light on these relationships between culture, structure, and policy. And to do this, we need to kind of use something known as Quant Crit, or critical quantitative work, which combines key theories, critical race theory and intersectionality, which you've probably heard a little bit about in the news, for understanding the socio-historical situations that we find ourselves in, right? And so the key takeaway that I want you to remember is that theory and methods must go together. You cannot sit here and bootstrap standard errors or try to get a bigger sample size and not think theoretically about why this matters. You need both, right? And so using statistical tools is a form of praxis. which means you should be accountable for how you think through these numbers, not just running the numbers, right, or crunching the numbers. So this all adds depth to shallow numbers, right? So just to kind of go through a Quant Crit primer really quick, we have to remember that quantification, these numbers do not capture the depth and complexity and fluidity of systems, right? The procedures are not value neutral. Categories must be challenged. They're not natural and fixed or predestined. And they don't overcome the lack of voices. At a certain point, we need to stop working with numbers and we need to start working with people and talking with them, right? As Yasmin Irizarry, who's a sociologist at the University of Texas, notes, quantitative methods, and that's a typo, wonderful, are a tool in our toolkits to document and understand inequality. It's not the end all be all, it's part of the process. So the census leads us to think about different racial categories, whether somebody's identified as Black or Hispanic or Latino or Asian American. These things developed over time since the 1700s, and this influences what we understand diversity to be on our campuses. And so the way we construct diversity ends up making identities into this pluralistic view that anybody can fit these benign categories. But again, categories have meaning, especially when it comes to race. And as Carly Ford and her colleague found, the way we present this information can skew the reality of what we understand diversity to look like on our campuses, even on our campus websites, right? And so this is a call for a push for accountability in higher education to think about how do we use these quantitative methods and understand who's on our campuses, right? So in 1997, the Office of Management and Budget created a new directive that said that anybody should be allowed to choose more than one box on the race ethnicity questions on the census. And so this allowed for one box approach to go away, that you can identify however you want with multiple categories. And so IPEDS, which is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System that all universities that receive federal financial aid must report to with data, was charged to make these changes. But they didn't do so until 2008. And even then, what they didn't necessarily follow the guidance, right? So how we report this information isn't necessarily how we report it in our own lives, right? So to give you a quick example of how this matters, we're going to consider the University of California's a way to document who's on their campus, okay? So I'm going to run through this kind of quickly, but you'll get the gist really easily with a figure, okay? So we're going to skip over this because it's really boring. But the one note I will put at the bottom of this is when we think about categories that are used, there's a lot of old dated categories, eugenic categories like Caucasian that are used. They're not better. They don't make you sound smarter. They're not more scientific, right? They came out of a racist eugenic era. And also, as you'll see in federal reporting, people can be referred to as aliens. That's dehumanizing. They're people, right? So we need to refer to people as such, okay? I want that to be a very quick little snippet from this slide before we move on, okay? So this is a very quick way of understanding how what we do with our numbers matters. And so across all these different bars, it's comparing the different ways that the representation at the University of California, Berkeley in the fall of 2018 is reported by the type of data, right? And so these are just for the different groups at the top of the figure. But what is really important here is from the far left to the far right for each group, it becomes aggregated, meaning people could identify with multiple groups, but then they're removed to only being identified with one. Then those categories are condensed down. And then some people are removed entirely, like international students, right? Across all of these different forms, okay? That's the kind of key takeaway, that how we report doesn't necessarily come out in how it's reported to the federal government, okay? And so I'm actually going to stop with one last slide here to talk about how diversity and segregation go hand in hand before we jump to the remaining slide. When we consider non-administrative staff and student affairs personnel, the people who are the housekeepers that work in the dining halls, that work maintenance, that do logistics for our campuses. For men, 17.5% of all men who work at colleges and universities work in these non-administrative student affairs positions, and 24% of women. However, when we kind of look at things, if you look at the bar graph on the right, you'll see that 63% of all people in these positions identify as white, which is actually one of the most diverse groups of employees on our college campuses. But the next set of bars shows the reality. Okay, so that first bar for whites, the blue bar, shows that 22.4%, and this is for women, 22.4% of all white women who work in colleges and universities are in these non-administrative and student affairs positions, right? However, 37.7% of Black women, 38.6% of Latino women, 15% of Asian American women, and 30% of Native American women work in these positions. So out of all of the women that identify with these groups, this is where a large segment are. These are the most underfunded, least supported positions, the most fragile positions on our campuses. So even if we look at the diversity on our campuses, we also need to remember that diversity doesn't mean that it's racism free or segregation free, right? So I'm going to jump to the final slides just because the other stuff really is boring, but I want to give us time for some questions. So when we get past the campus comment stuff, which I can touch on a little bit later if you would like, what does this all mean, right? So we're going to return to Du Bois real quick. And hearing of the lynching of a man in Georgia, Du Bois said that one could not be a cool, calm, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved, right? Research needs to matter. But as colleague Rayshawn Ray eloquently put recently in light of all the racial justice movements, some of us do not have the luxury to sit in the ivory tower and do pure research, right? Being disconnected from local communities outside of the symbolic and physical barriers of the ivory tower that detach universities from neighborhoods they are located in is a privilege that some of us do not have. Our research matters, and sometimes we have been able to pull away from that. We don't need to do that, right? These numbers, this research matters. So what can campus leaders do? Talk seriously about racial equity on campus without relying on generic approaches. Don't use the same old talking points, right? Speak directly to how you're addressing what communities on and off your campus, marginalized and vulnerable, are saying needs to be done, right? Get involved, right? Hold yourselves and your colleagues accountable and describe it publicly, right? Sometimes we do a lot of things behind closed doors. This is not one of those times. Further embed racial equity research into universities. Sometimes there's only one or two people, if anybody at all, that does this regularly. They'll do reports every few years. This needs to be an every year thing, right? In many different ways. And go beyond the numbers. Talk to people. Get faculty who are experts on these things involved. Have students get involved. Show them how they can work to make their communities better instead of just being a subject of study, right? And racial equity must center on students of color and not simply doing racial equity work, right? You shouldn't try to look good. You should do the hard work, because if it's really hard, it's not going to look good. It's going to look messy. But that's the whole point, that these things are really entrenched in our communities and we need to change them, right? And listen and learn and work with students, but don't co-opt and water down their labor on equity efforts. Students do most of the work. Administrators and faculty and staff oftentimes get the prestige of doing something well, but it's the students who lay the foundation, right? And don't, if you're trying to change organizational goals, don't look for the numbers and look for changing hearts and minds. You have to actually change policies and processes to make things matter. And so I'll leave you with this last thing about being collaborators with communities for racial equality on and off campus. We must remove ourselves from thinking that what we do on campus doesn't have a meaning for what happens off campus. And we must work diligently to create organizational and policy changes so that we can remake higher education to the ideals we hold true. Just as there was a failure on a massive scale to address COVID-19 throughout 2020, there's also been a continued failure to hear and take up the racial justice demands that emerged in that year as well. Universities were, again, a battleground for societal changes. And like generations past, we have witnessed slow change on some campuses, significant progressive feats on others, and still little change for many other institutions, as the demands by students and community members for addressing racial injustice on and off campus fell into the institutional void. As we kind of seen, quantification can be a part of this, but it can also hide things, and it can make the solutions difficult to achieve. And so at the core of what needs to be done is to change our colleges and universities. And these institutions, unfortunately, hold fast to race and racism, but take little responsibility for racial inequality and understanding why it exists. Regardless of how we measure this inequality, allowing our institutions to continue absolving themselves while they crush and erase people's dreams will only have us faulting each other. As the Student for Fair Admissions case against Harvard shows, asserting that we simply need to adjust our statistical models to see the numbers more clearly rather than change the organizations we hold dear is a faulty approach. Until we are willing to challenge where, how, and why we work in higher education, how we use these numbers, we will continue to be surrounded by racial inequality and remain ignorant about how we can change that reality now and in the future. So again, I appreciate the time and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Byrd. We do have some questions, so if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function on our webinar. So I'll start with some of the questions that have already been asked. So this first question is from Edgar Randolph. Can you speak to the problematic nature of categorizing ethnicity and identity into race? South Asians are considered Black in a British system, Asian in a Northern system, and white in a Southern system. So for instance, how would you categorize somebody like Nikki Haley? And how does she identify, how does she use her ethnicity to benefit herself? And how does an admissions committee and university use her ethnicity to benefit themselves?
That's a very, very, very complex set of questions, but also very important. The answer is, it depends. And it sounds like a cop-out, but bear with me for a second. If somebody comes to the US that's not a US citizen, what ends up happening is for federal reporting practices, they become identified as what I was mentioning before, a non-resident alien or an international student. And so regardless of their race and ethnicity, they get lumped into this one category. And so we can understand, for example, who might be coming through and compare colleges on that regard. So that's the institutional way of doing things, saying we're diversifying by having a lot more international students, but we don't know who they are sometimes. And we also don't really understand their experiences by the way our institutions use that data. And to kind of give you one example of how difficult it is to use this information for reporting practices, you fill out an application that asks for your race and ethnicity information. But you also fill out scholarship applications. But you also might fill out student work applications that ask for different things. All of these pieces of information could use different categories, right? And may require you to identify in slightly different ways. But when you combine these, you might get a different answer for somebody who has different ancestry and identifies in different ways, right? So the simple way of understanding this is what you identify with and how it's used depends on what processes and information can be available to you to identify with, but also what might be available to the organization. So again, there's a lot of different things that your questions raise. And one thing I will point out with the Varsity Blues scandal, one thing that happened that is really pernicious was people were changing the race and ethnicity of their sons and daughters' applications to be identified as a racial or ethnic minority applicant, even though they didn't identify anywhere else as such. And that didn't have a bearing. What had a bearing was they went through side doors that they paid for, but they thought
that race mattered so much that they should do something to look differently on applications, when really it wasn't anything about that, because there's a whole range of information. So again, people will try to abuse and use myths to get around with some of this stuff, but it's a lot more bureaucratic, and it's a lot more convoluted than just identifying as one race or ethnicity, for example. But thank you for your questions. Those are really deep and important questions.
Thank you. So this question is from an anonymous attendee. You mentioned how opportunity structure impacts merit, which plays a role in undergraduate admissions and keeps racial diversity low. I'd imagine this is compounded for graduate education. Do you have any thoughts on how this can be addressed at the graduate level? And I'm just going to add a coda to that. Thinking about test scores in particular for graduate school, what do you think about that?
I was a really bad test taker. I'll admit it. I was horrible at it. Matter of fact, I proved the psychologist wrong. Every time I took it, I got worse. And that was for the GRE. The GRE doesn't predict past your first semester, which gestures to the fact that it just means it predicts whether you can read a lot and think a lot. But that doesn't really mean that you're giving the support structure to do that. And that's a really important kind of question about graduate school, right? What happens when you're 3 years old? What happens when you're 12? What happens when you're 22 or 30, or whenever you end up going to graduate school, matter for your chances of getting in and completing graduate school, right? People talk about cumulative advantages and disadvantages. So we know if you have preschool education, right, that matters for how you're going to start elementary school. We know that if you're identified as gifted and talented, that can have what Dr. Sandy Darity and Carolyn Tyson have identified as an anointing effect, that by being seen as gifted, people will always give you the benefit of the doubt. And because white students, for example, are seen as gifted more often than Black and Latinx students, for example, that means they're given more time to do things. If they have a bad day, it's because they had a bad day, not because they're incapable, right? And so when you have these things go on, if you look at who goes on to AP classes in high school, being identified in third, fourth, fifth grade as gifted is the number one predictor of going on and getting into AP classes and honors classes, right? Teacher recommendations can also obviously have an impact on whether you go to certain classes. So all these things are laying the foundation to get you into undergraduate. But then if you make it to undergraduate, say you want to be an engineer, we'll just use this as an example. A lot of people talk about STEM. So we're going to talk about it a little bit, the importance of science, technology, engineering, and math. They're very highly valued degree programs, but they're also very segregated, right? The opportunities to do it are very racialized and socioeconomically based, right? So if you are certain types of engineering majors, you have to buy materials, right? But how much do those materials cost for your classes, right? What happens if you have to work for pay that you're helping support family, right? What happens if you don't get a response from your professor that you're exploring about being an engineer and they never return the email? Is that sending a signal? Are you getting other signals, microaggressions in the classes? Maybe the TA ignores your question because they think it's silly instead of a serious question that maybe everybody else in the class has as well. But because of who you are or how they view you, they're not seeing that as important. So all these things are laying the foundation, not just for college, but also who gets into graduate school and what we think graduate studies should be about. So to kind of go back to Dr. Gillespie's question about the GRE, the GRE is just like the SAT. Matter of fact, it's housed in the same unit as the SAT and the ETS in Princeton, New Jersey. It's founded for the same purposes, to help give us information, shorthand information about somebody being capable of doing something. But all the data shows that it's not that simple, that really it's giving people opportunities and supporting them that makes them successful, right? You see this with faculty as well. And I'll just add this as one last point. With faculty, there's this big debate about, are there certain institutions that always get tapped when they have somebody graduate with a PhD and they just get hired, right? So we'll use Harvard. If somebody graduates with a Harvard PhD in some field, then they must be the best, so we got to hire them, right? And what happens is they're being hired by other institutions that have a lot of resources and opportunities too. So what happens is we see how people have higher floors than other people's ceilings, right? They can only fall so far because they're always supported. And this is happening all the way through people's lives, right? So when we think about opportunity structure, it's not just about resources and opportunities, it's the extent to which somebody is given more opportunities and resources over somebody else. And then that one person that's given less is told to catch up, right? That they can break through that ceiling. But the sad fact is, by the time they get through that ceiling, if they get through it, somebody else is already 2 floors above because they never had to go through that in the first place, right? So these are all compounding factors that dictate who's going to be in our classes, not just, in high school or college, but in graduate school, who's going to be our colleagues at the NIH, who's going to be leading our nonprofits, right? All these different things are all, a long line, a long trajectory, a life course, if you will, through different organizations that allocate these resources and opportunities differently. So yeah, graduate school is really important. It's actually one of the least studied areas of colleges and universities, but also so is faculty and staff to a certain extent. And that's why I focused on staff members. They're some of the most invisible people on our campuses, and they're the only reason why our campuses run. And so if we can't understand how to fix segregation and inequality among our staff, how do we think we're going to be able to do things with students who are willing to do things, right? If we're willing to work with students, but unwilling to work with somebody else, we're just going to continue to perpetuate the same unequal campus year in and year out.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question from Brianna Williams next. Can you please explain why race-based quotas are so bad? Why would it be bad for schools that receive public funding to require their student body to reflect the community?
That's one of the biggest questions and about race conscious admissions. And so we'll kind of go back to one of the points I raised about how people view inequality, that it's individualized. And so one of the biggest points of the civil rights movement was to move us away from essentialism, that by being identified as part of a certain community, that you have certain capabilities, certain knowledges, certain intellect, which again, that's a very racialized concept that we can talk about further. And by moving away from essentialism to showing that people do have individual abilities that aren't based on race, that aren't based on gender or class, people have taken that all the way and say, oh, okay, so you say that race doesn't matter, then it shouldn't matter at all. And what we see in terms of who's represented on our campus, if we take public universities, right? If we think about the University of Georgia, does that look like everybody in Georgia is attending that institution? No. It shows a disparity between who's in the community and who's on campus. But what ends up happening are people say, well, students should try harder. They should, if they didn't apply, they should have at least tried. Maybe they should have taken that extra AP class. But what happens is they also recognize that schools are unequal, but that's not our problems as higher education professionals. That if something happens in the community, that's on the community. We need to fix K through 12 schools, absolutely. But that's not my job, right? So they kind of absolve themselves. And that's where race conscious policies come up, is trying to acknowledge that these things come into play and factor into people's life chances, but having people really sit down and talk about why that matters, instead of thinking that it's a personal affront, saying, look, this is part of our communities, but we need to recognize our full community and what's available to everybody in there, or maybe not available to them. And so should our campuses theoretically look like our communities? Yeah, sure. But we also know that there's a lot of racialized and gendered and classed inequalities and systems of power that shape who even thinks about applying. If they thought the University of Georgia was a welcoming, inclusive place, would they apply? Sure. It's not just about the quality, it's about whether they would actually be treated fairly as well when they get there. And that's not just to pick on Georgia, that's many institutions. So I'll put that out there at the end.
Great. Thank you. So an anonymous attendee asks, I'm still a little confused about how multiracial people are categorized in racial diversity reporting. Can you clarify how this is broken down statistically? Did they split the percentage evenly between selected races or just choose one?
So that's a really good point. And I kind of went through it because I was running out of time. I had so much information and not enough time, right? So what happens with with people who identify as multiracial, it depends on how they identify, and it depends on how they are supposed to be reported. So if somebody identifies as Black and Asian, for example, right, any Asian ethnicity, they can be identified as multiracial, and for some institutions, they will just report them as multiracial or ethnic, or two or more races and ethnicities. However, if somebody identifies as Black and Latinx, because of the reporting guidelines, if you identify as Latinx, that trumps your multiraciality. Therefore, you become Latinx for the reporting guidelines of the institution. So we can see how even with how somebody identifies, depending on what groups they're connected to, the guidelines for institutional reporting changes for who ends up being considered multiracial. So I hope that's a simple way of kind of looking at it. It really does depend on how these protocols are laid out. And that's why I said numbers are racialized, why quantification matters. It's thinking through, how do we understand group connections, and how do we think that they matter for how we describe our campuses and who has opportunities or not. So multiracial individuals are definitely a very important conversation point about why this is a bad thing in many ways, and how they can be misconstrued and maybe undercut how we understand different experiences that are important to try to support students.
Thank you. So the next question is from Chiara Giotto. In Belgium, our universities don't want a race census based on because of the nationwide colorblind ideology. How can we motivate our universities to change this culture of race being a taboo?
That's a very hard question. The simple way of putting it is you need to talk about it, right? So we know that opportunities for schools are segregated, right? So if we imagine that for some reason a classroom is segregated by Black and white students, and all the Black students are in the back of the room, all the white students are sitting in the desk in the front of the room, and we turn off the lights and we say, go find your seats that you've been sitting in, but you're blindfolded and you can't see. What ends up happening is we see that people start, tripping over each other. They'll trip over desks. But in the end, after a handful of minutes, we'll see that more white students will get to their seats than Black students. Does that mean that white students weren't trying to get to their seats and be part of the class? No, but it means that the structure of opportunity to get to their seats was not the same as everybody else. And that's been laid in the foundation for who has schools close to their communities, who has full science labs in their schools, all these different things that have been laid out through literal policies, not just politicians, but through policies over time, that we need to have serious considerations with, not just in the US, but across the globe, right? One of the biggest points that philosopher Charles Mills points out is that white supremacy is a global phenomenon. It's not just a relic of the US. It's not something that happened in relation to Germany in the 30s and 40s, but this is something that happens everywhere, right? And so if we try to push back and say, well, we should be beyond that. Sure, ideally, we should be beyond that, but we're not, and we won't be until we actually confront it.
Thank you. So in keeping with the previous question, are titles for racialized institutions like HBCUs still necessary to promote diversity at these institutions?
So the short answer is it depends, which is pretty much every single answer I have because it's contextual, right? Historically Black colleges and universities still educate a majority of all Black undergraduates who receive degrees every year. There's only 100 of them. And for certain institutions, they actually produce more Black medical students than Harvard, Princeton, and Yale combined, right? And they do this on fewer dollars. They do this with fewer resources. They do this with little respect from their peers, including where they're often sending their students to attend medical school, right? So historically Black colleges and universities, that designator is important, not just as an identifier of a historical past, but still a continued present, right, of inequality and vital community resources. There's been conversations about, as we're in Black History Month, for example, and every month is Black History Month. I just want to point that out, not just one. So talk about it all the time, year round, please. Thank you. But churches have been really important. centers of worship, not just for Christianity, but for other centers around the world, have been pillars to communities. And the White Church, for example, is a huge community resource. But so are many of the institutions that were founded by Black churches across the South. And so what we need to understand is when it comes to historically White colleges and universities, it's not so much about the designation, but the meaning. That they were put in place at a time when Black students were almost completely excluded from all opportunities for higher learning, and yet they still survived and thrived. So why not make sure that there's opportunities for people to see that history as something strong to be connected to instead of denigrated and folded into? Because as we've seen throughout desegregation eras, simply integrating doesn't mean that people will be supported, and nor that they'll be treated equitably. And so these institutions are still an invaluable piece of our communities, and we should support them more, not less.
Great, thank you. So in the time that we have left, we're going to go through 5 more questions. So the next 4 questions are about application. The first question is from Francine Allen, one of our fellows. In discussions surrounding education and racial equality, I often hear it's said that college is not for everyone. Can you discuss what you think that statement means and how it connects to who gets into college and to what college a student might be admitted to?
So it's a kind of double-edged sword, right? This college is not for everyone. Not everybody wants to go to college. They have a good idea of employment that doesn't require college education or post-secondary education of any kind, an associate degree, and that's fine, right? Like, that shouldn't be denigrating those positions. And I think that's something that is the flip side of college is not for everybody, is simply because somebody doesn't go to college doesn't mean they're not smart, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not valuable members of our community or performing jobs that, simply put, somebody with a PhD can't do, right? I mean, let's just put that out there. Having a college degree doesn't mean that you are just more capable. It means you're more prepared for a very specific type of work. It doesn't mean that you can just do all the work because you got a college degree, right? And so the flip side of the college isn't for everybody is also a way of kind of reinforcing inequality. That if somebody applies, but they weren't supported by a teacher who forgot to send in their letter of recommendation for a scholarship, that was the only way that they were going to be able to afford, going to college, then saying, well, college isn't for everybody is a way of acknowledging that inequality is right there front and center as a lived experience, and that, there's just little we can do. And again, it kind of absolves people from challenging why, if somebody really wants to go to college, opening up that opportunity fully to apply, to get away from how much we use test scores, how much we use the fees, right? Not everybody can afford applying to more than one college. I only applied to one college because I was like, I don't have this kind of money. I was working all the time. My family was supportive of me and helped, but that didn't change the perspective of what was available and what opportunities I could or couldn't pursue, right? Those matter, right? The Thomas theorem. Some of y'all in sociology have probably heard this, political science, economists. The Thomas theorem says that if you perceive something that's real, then it'll be real in their consequences. So if you see that if you think that a door is closed to you at the college application stage, then you're going to act like it's going to be closed, because why am I going to waste my energy on a rejection, right? Why am I going to see that? But the discussion about is college isn't for everybody, it's a way for us to kind of skirt the harder issues about, well, have we made it available so that everybody that wants to apply can, right? It's the same thing with free college policies. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, we're going to have janitors with PhDs. Again, that's denigrating the janitors, right? But also, it's simply saying we're trying to remove barriers so that people, if they want to try, they can, and they don't have to worry about another barrier in their way of maybe being sexually mobile through a college education. That's all it is. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to go get a PhD. It doesn't mean that people won't go to community colleges, but we got to at least remove these barriers so people can try to live to their fullest potential instead of always explaining why they can't.
Thank you. So the next question comes from an anonymous attendee. I am a student on a diversity and inclusion committee in my department. I've been pushing to have an anonymous survey sent to students every semester to attempt to assess their sense of belonging. These questions are based directly on Harvard's Pulse survey. Race and gender identity categories are included with an other and fill in the blank option on both. Are things like an anonymous survey a good initial approach to identifying problems in a department?
They can be, but it also depends on how big your department is, right? If somebody is the lone Black woman in a department and they fill out a survey, then how anonymous is it really when you start explaining the results, right? And so these are some serious complications that end up coming up because we have what's known in quantitative circles as the small n feature, or small sample sizes. N's are representative of sample sizes. But higher education scholar Sean Harper, if you haven't looked up his stuff, definitely look up Sean's work. What Dr. Harper says is N equals people, right? And so if we're having an issue with trying to get at people's experiences because they're so low in representation in certain departments, and we're afraid that their feedback isn't going to be anonymous in some way, the problem isn't that the feedback can't be anonymized as much as we want. It's the fact that we have low representation in those departments, right? So being able to collect and thematicise across some of this survey information would be good without, kind of unveiling who some of these students are who might be the only ones in that entire department. So again, those are some of the sticking points with surveys. Like, they're really good. They can give you some great information, especially about sense of belonging. But the flip side is sometimes we don't utilize it well to not only tell the story of people, but also protect them so they can continue to tell their story, and we can push for that departmental or institutional change we want.
Thank you. So another anonymous question asks, how do you suggest a graduate school support their minority students? Do minority students need more, extra, or different types of support?
All the above. One of the things, again, I want to just reiterate is until we fully realize that whole motto of equal opportunity, until we actually make it equal for people to take advantage and have opportunities, we're not going to be able to do it. And so if we think about minoritized students attending graduate school, we need to think about mentoring. But before we think about mentoring, who could be their mentors? And if we're talking about who can be their mentors, then we need to talk about faculty diversity initiatives. If we're talking about faculty diversity initiatives, we also need to talk about what are the resources faculty are going to have if we decide to hire more faculty that could lead to more faculty of color. Like right now, a lot of people have been putting out cluster hires around anti-racism and racial justice. Many institutions have been doing this to try to help diversify not only the conversation, but who's represented on there. That's great. What do you do when they get there? Have you changed how, say, a Black faculty member who talks about racial justice and abolition of prisons, do you actually support them? Do you have policies prepared for when somebody might come after them because they're trying to make sure that prisons not only don't exist, but that prisoners have a life after they're released, right? That's important work. But having somebody supported like that also means that they can also give opportunities for graduate students from different backgrounds to be mentored in new ways. Instead of just saying, well, you go to graduate school to get a PhD. Then you go on to a research university like Emory or Michigan or Louisville or Stanford or any of the others. There's 2,334-year colleges and universities, not-for-profit colleges and universities. Most are not research universities, and many of them are better connected at our communities, and graduate students want that more than a lot of us faculty realize or even want to do. One of the best things, and this goes back to the Du Bois quote, and also the one from Dr. Rashawn Ray, is that we've done a great job of disconnecting how faculty, how academia works with communities, so much so that family members, including some of my own, will say, well, you don't understand how the real world works. And I'm like, I'm a sociologist. This is all I do. Like every day I talk about this. right? Like I'm studying it, I'm involved in it, like what, this is what happens. But the way we view higher education is disconnected from how the world works. And sometimes that needs to be reinstituted to support our graduate students who are doing most of the pushing to innovate, not only how we connect with our communities, but how we do the work in science, how we do it in the humanities. They push for new theoretical perspectives, they create them, right? That shouldn't be something that's like, oh, cutting edge and not for our time. Our time's now. So let's stop being a stick in the mud and let's actually work with students, supporting them through different mentoring efforts, giving them opportunities to connect with mentors that might not even be on their campuses, but across campuses, right? Making sure that they don't have to work summers so that they can actually work on their ideas through different research initiatives, right? Or teaching opportunities in the community, not just at the institution. All these things could be beneficial for minoritized graduate student populations, not just trying to get them to be a faculty member down the line.
Great, thank you. So we have two more questions. Thank you for bearing with us. So I'm going to insert a question here about gifted education, since you mentioned it in your talk. There are some people sort of in response to existing and entrenched inequities who want to completely get rid of gifted education. And I was just curious about what your opinion was based on your research.
So I'll give a quick little personal example. I moved from a small town in Virginia in the mountains, which you can kind of hear the twang a little bit sometimes. And I moved to Charlotte, and I lived in Charlotte at the height of the 90s busing battles. And, I was a decent student. I wasn't great. I wasn't always, I'll admit, I was not great. But I was pretty similar, kind of grades as the people that I was living around, which I happened to live in this thing called the suburbs for the first time ever. I saw them on TV, and now you put a country boy in the suburbs. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. So we get on the bus and we get to a racially diverse school, because again, this is the height of the busing. And most of my friends go to the right side of the hallway, and I go to the left. And I end up being one of the only white students in a black and brown classroom. We were considered remedial or normal. All of my white friends that happened to be on the bus with me, all were considered gifted. I took no test. My parents did not raise a ruckus, right? But soon after a little bit of time, I ended up moving back to that same small town in Virginia that I'm from. And within a week, again, didn't take a test, I was labeled gifted. And all of a sudden, I got study hall, I got some extra tutoring time for math, all these things that weren't available to other students who I had literally grown up with. And all I did was live in another place and come back, and they saw me as gifted. My grades hadn't really changed. Matter of fact, they probably were a little bit worse, I'll be honest. And so all of a sudden, all the classes that I moved into for high school were all honors. Again, I didn't take any tests. My grades weren't perfect, but I had that opportunity because of how people viewed me, right? At the same time, almost all of the Black students in my class, which is a very small school, were put in normal general education classes throughout high school. And the one student who was in the honors classes my first year ended up getting pushed out by a teacher who didn't think that they were doing the work that they were turning in. They didn't see the brilliance in them, right? So gifted education gives a lot of resources to a very small group of people, and again continues to raise their floors throughout their lives so that they have benefits of the doubt and more opportunities to succeed and fewer opportunities to fail, right? What happens if we spread those resources out to everybody and continue to raise everybody's floors so that they can have more opportunities to succeed, to explore things in science, to explore things in English, be poets, not just engineers, right? We need both. We don't do that very well. And gifted education is a way for people to kind of consolidate or opportunity hoard, as we like to call it, and limit access to those resources and opportunities for a majority of students. And oftentimes this is racialized and classed around white middle class families. You definitely have to put that out there. That's one of the drivers.
Thank you. So the final question is from Tamara Blue, who asked you to wax a little personal. Do you feel that your identity as a white male gives you an advantage in having race conversations with other white people?
Yes, in many ways. And I'm not going to hide that. What I'm saying right now is, some of the ideas are old as dirt, right? To use a saying. Du Bois wrote this stuff in the 1800s, all the way until his death in the mid 1960s. He was ignored by the same places that employ people like me, who look like me, who talk maybe a little bit better without the country twang. But that happens, right? And one of the things that's really important to remember is that the idea of critical race theory did not come from a white man at Harvard. It didn't come from a white man at the University of North Carolina or any other place like that, right? It came from Black and Latinx scholars in law schools who were fighting to be recognized and their voices and communities represented and heard. Intersectionality is not just about Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. It's about third world movements and third world movements in the 60s. It's about community organizations today led by women of color that are non-gender binary, transgender, that represent everybody. And still, we need to talk about, again, why I'm up here. Like, this is something that I'm passionate about. This is something I connect to, but it's also something that I will not say that I am perfect, nor that I represent the whole conversation about what racial equity in higher education is. Matter of fact, I represent very little of it because very little of it's represented in our universities. We need to adjust that at the community level through how we reach out, through mentoring programs and K through 12 pipeline programs, to how we hire faculty, what we want them to teach, how we treat them when they're there. Graduate students, when they come up with ideas, cutting edge ideas that really break ground on how we understand why race matters, they need to be met where they are. They don't need to kind of just go through all these hoops simply because that's what all the hoops have always been, right? That's how we perpetuate having predominantly white faculty, how we always see who's more likely to be Nobel Prize winners, who is generally seen as brilliant in our communities versus others, right? Like, those things shouldn't be happening. And I'll call attention to that. And this is a platform, hopefully, that if you take anything away besides, I have a book and it's talking about some numbers or whatever, it's listen to more people who don't look like me, because they're probably saying stuff way better than I am, and they've been saying it longer, and I'm okay with that. But I'm also a partner in trying to fix this thing with them and not just be the front of it. So I'll just kind of end with that.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I know that there were many people who were here for the first time, so I do want to let you know that this is part of a regular series. So I hope that you come back next Monday at noon, where our speaker will be Dr. Patrick McKay from Temple University. But as I mentioned at the outset of this talk, this is the first of two talks this week that are dealing with diversity in higher education. So Thursday's talk, which is sponsored by the Office of the Provost and the Division of Undergraduate Affairs, is going to focus on the lived experience of students of color at elite universities. So I hope that you sign up for the talk by Dr. Anthony Jack. Please join me in thanking Dr. Carson Byrd for a wonderful and engaging talk, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.